There are three things that are going on now, the three most important things.
Okay.
And it's important to know those three things and then to understand them well.
In your opinion, how has this last couple of years been in the history of investing for you? In the history of the last 40, 50 years, is this a really, really bad time in your lifetime? Or is this just another bad time, but not greater than previous bad times?
You mean in the world?
In the world.
There are three things that are going on now, the three most important things that are going on to great extremes that have not existed since the 1930 to 45 period.
Okay.
And it's important to know those three things and then to understand them well. The first is what is going on with money and credit when you get to something like a zero interest rate and you need buying power. The government needs buying power, but they can't tax it. So what we have is the production of a lot of debt that the central bank prints money and buys that debt to spend. And the last time that happened, in the last few years, it happened starting in 2008, interest rates hit zero. They couldn't lower their interest rates. So they had to print a lot of debt and the government went in and bought it. Okay. And we're coming to the end of a debt cycle. So this is a big thing, because where does the money come from? And who will get what? The government will now determine that, and then they'll print it and it'll devalue money. And how money flows, a big deal. So that's number one. The second one are wealth and political gaps that are causing great conflicts. Throughout history, there's always been the main things that everybody's always fought over is money and power, particularly political power. So what we have is a situation when you have a large wealth gap and you have an economic downturn, particularly if you put a lot of debt having at the same time, you have a fight. I mean, that's been true through history. And it's reflected in the political gap. So the political gap is classic political gap. Left, right, capitalist, socialist. Well, how do you distribute it? How are you going to deal with that? That becomes the other. And how you fight. So that's the second of the two, this wealth political gap that's causing the conflict. And it's coming at a time where we don't have much money, because we don't have a good financial position. We're printing and putting it out. So
We're still paying off debts still, right?
yeah, but with made up money. I mean, meaning what happened, like COVID was such a good example. Okay, you have COVID, and a lot of people and companies had falls in their income that would be ruinous. Okay, if checks didn't go out, we would have had a revolution.
Right.
And so those checks and how do you save everything and so on. And it's not like the government had real money. They didn't have any money. They already owe a lot.
So they just printed more money to give to
So
people.
they made more debt, and then the government and the Federal Reserve printed it, and the checks went out, which diminishes the value of money and so on and changes things. So then the third thing is the rise of a great power to challenge an existing great power. So the rise of China to challenge the United States. In all history, there are world orders. What that means are the dominant power. It's like in nature almost, the big bull or something. Anyway, there's the dominant power. And then what happens is in 1945, we entered the American world order. The United States won the war and it ended. And then in 1945, the winners of the war carved up the world. We had 80% of what was considered money at the time, gold, 80% of the world's money, essentially. We counted for half the world's economy. And the rules were set in the United States, basically. That's why the United Nations is in New York, the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington, D.C., because we began the American century. We are now at a time, we've never had another power challenge us in the same way. There was the Soviet Union, but they were always a fraction of the size economically, so couldn't compete on that same basis. They had nuclear weapons, but they didn't have the economic power and so on. But now we're dealing with China coming on as a power. I spent a lot of time in China over the last 36 years, by the way, and I admire how they're doing a lot of things.
Right.
I mean, I know it's controversial to say that, but in terms of like, they're a power.
Yeah.
Whoa! Like since I started going there, their average income has increased by 30 times. So they're a comparable power, and they're also growing faster. And so that has an effect. So those three things are things that never happened in my lifetime before, but happened before in history, which led me to do the studies of what happened in history and the lessons I could gain.
What is that, those three things, money and credit, wealth and political gaps, and the rise of China? What does someone like myself or some 30, 40, 45-year-old, 20-year-old, what should they do with that information? What should they be aware of? How should they apply it? Does it apply to people in America, general America, or is it only applied to the wealthy? What should we be thinking of?
No, it affects everybody. You know, it affects, like, we know, let's start with ourselves. Most importantly, forget about the outside thing. Can we be healthy and strong? And what do we need to do? Like, to know that you have to be in it together. Like, if we can row in the same direction, if we can have thoughtful disagreement and get past that, if we can be in it together, like the wealthy and the poor, you know, and if you figure it out, and I know it sounds so difficult, but at the same time, if you read history and you see what happens when it's not, when you have a civil war, like we could be on the brink of a civil war. That sounds so crazy, but the truth is, in most countries, almost every century, there was a civil war or a revolution. So it's almost inevitable that we're going to have something. You either resolve it or you start fighting so badly that you really do
until you resolve it
to each other.
Until you resolve it, yeah.
Once you cross a certain line, there's no coming back, because you do the damage, you demonize, and that person's such an enemy, or that class of people is such an enemy, that the communication's gone and the fight. Well, you see this in politics today. In other words, is there a respect for the system and a mutual respect of trying to resolve these types of things? Or will they go to any lengths to win? Because a constitution or law will only carry you to so far. There has to be an element of respect for it, right? If you think about the presidential election, it's quite something. We as a country, as a people, when somebody might win the popular vote, somebody else wins the electoral vote, there's not even an argument. Like in other countries, you might say, those who had the popular vote would say, what the hell, I've won the popular vote, I think it matters, and somebody says electoral vote and so on. Okay, there's not a question about that. Now, when you start to say, okay, is it this vote or that vote or this thing or that, and how far are you willing to go to fight, and does the rules matter? When you start to get cross that line and you do harm, you hurt, and you alienate, then you go to accelerate this process. And people should know what that looks like, how terrible it is. So maybe if they know what it looks like and how terrible it is, and they can empathize a little bit. But I see people don't see it. I'm living in Greenwich, Connecticut. Connecticut has the highest per capita income in the country, and it's got the largest wealth gap. Most of the people in Connecticut are pretty poor, some cases very poor. Oh, I'll give you an example. This is the community my wife works to help, high school students. 22% of the high school students in Connecticut are either disengaged or disconnected. What that means is disengaged means they have an absentee rate which is greater than 25%, and they're failing classes.
They don't show up to class.
That's right. They show up, 3/4 of the time, and they're failing. Or that's disengaged. Disconnected is they don't know where they are. They've dropped out of school. 22%, 1 in 5. So school is not working for them. And they're in desperately poor areas. Like, okay, we had the coronavirus. And so her efforts and our efforts are philanthropic. That's what got her involved. They don't have computers. They don't have connectivity. They have problems getting food. They get food in school. They need the food in school because they don't have adequate food, okay? And this is Connecticut, and it's right up the road. So we bought these kids, 60,000 kids, computers, and then we're trying to get connectivity. And you start to see this. This is the same world. So I live in one neighborhood with my community, and then there's the other. They don't understand each other. They haven't lived there. They haven't empathized. And in fact, there are resentments on both sides, right? Like the people in my community, they're very rich by comparison to those other people, but also to take care of their families, to educate them. They have their own challenges, the work-life balance and so on. They have their financial insecurities and so on. So that's what they're focused on. And then they might think, oh, these other people, they're not taking care of themselves. Why don't they pull themselves up by the bootstraps? Do you know what it's like to be a kid growing up in that neighborhood and trying to, what are you talking about? You can't pull yourself up. There's a problem. There's not enough food. There are gangs. Even walking to school, there's neighborhoods that are gang shootings, and there are not enough police to do it. So these two worlds exist. And then the others say, here we are, and you're walking around with your fancy cars and your, fancy clothes, and we're suffering. I mean, come on. And so they don't understand each other and so on. We have to get past this. We have to be in it together, I think. Otherwise, we're going to kill each other.